I haven't spoken with you in probably, I mean, at least 6 months. So, what's kind of fresh on your mind?
So, what I think is happening right now is we are in the midst of a crack up boom. And as your readers maybe are familiar with, a crack up boom is raised basically when the asset markets appreciate because the currency is depreciating. Now, when I'm thinking about the crack up boom, I'm not really thinking about the Fed. As we all know, the Fed has tremendous influence, but at the end of the day, it's the commercial banks that create money, but also the government when it issues debt. Because in the modern financial system, treasury securities are very much money like assets. And so, what I'm seeing is that the US Treasury, the US Congress, uh, the federal government is basically going to be spending trillions and trillions of dollars forever. So recently, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which is the agency that makes forecasts on these things, they came out with a forecast, and they're saying that from now until basically forever, the fiscal deficit is going to be about 5% of GDP. Now, this I think is a really big paradigm shift, and why the future will not look like the past. In the past, we always had all these people talking about the deficit, how it's too big, we got to be careful and so forth. But all those guys are gone now. Now, the CBO is a government agency and it's obligated to make projections based on current law. So all they do is they look at what's been passed and make a projection based on that. But as we all know, the law changes all the time. So what I think is more useful is just to look at the culture that we're in. And
Right.
I think we're in a political culture where one, uh, people like free stuff, right? I think about how happy people are to have their student loans forgiven. Think about how happy the Congress is to spend billions and billions of dollars on foreign ventures and military spending. You don't even have to believe. You can just look at the fiscal deficit over the past few decades, and it just goes up. Now, when I look at so I've been looking at the projections in detail, and what's really interesting is that so the structural 5% fiscal deficit, it's going higher, largely due to two things. One, of course, is Social Security and Medicare, which we all know we have an aging population, and as all the boomers age, they're going to be collecting Social Security. They're going to have higher medical costs, so that's a structural increase in federal spending. That's well understood. Another thing that's well understood is interest expense. As many people have noted, we have a large stock of debt, and as interest rates go higher, well, that interest expense is going to rise too. That's one thing. Now, the third thing that's interesting in this projection and why it's only 5% deficit is that it projects that the discretionary part of the fiscal deficit, well, it's going to trend towards multi-decade lows. Now, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
How could we have one category of fiscal spending trend towards multi-decade lows? Well, that's what they have to project because it's based on current law. So discretionary spending is broken down into two categories. One is military spending, and the other is non-military. Now, military spending, it ebbs and flows a lot with geopolitical conflict. It was very large during the Cold War, rose again during the Iraq War, and has declined since. But it looks like we're heading into a world where there's more geopolitical conflict, and we see
Right.
that on the news every day. So I think that's not going to decrease. But the worst, let's just assume it stays where it's been the past few years. Now, the second thing, part of discretionary spending, is basically everything else. It's the government payroll, it's education, it's stuff like that. And it looks like the government is creating a lot of jobs. It looks like a lot of people want free student loans. It looks like a lot of people want to spend money on climate change stuff. Like the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think that's going to have to go up too. So when you just assume that the discretionary part, again, three parts of the government budget: discretionary, mandatory, and interest expense. Now, if you just assume that the discretionary part just stays around where it is right now as a percent of GDP, then you're looking at a fiscal deficit that's about 7% of GDP going forward.
Right.
Now, that is, of course, terrible for the republic, but when you're just printing and spending that much money, you are going to depreciate the currency, and not necessarily depreciating the currency against other currencies because everyone else is doing more or less the same thing, but depreciate it against assets. And so we see home prices rise. We see the equity market go to the moon. Although I think that we are a bit too hot right now, But I think that's the big game plan for the next few years. Now, that also has direct impacts on the economy, of course. On the economic front, I think that we're not going to go into. I think we're going to probably have a stagnant economy. We're going to grow, but not by a lot, and inflation is going to remain higher than it has before the pandemic. So maybe let's say 4%, 3-4% inflation going forward, and lower economic growth. It's not going to be super painful, but it's not going to feel good.
Right. So now, correct me if I'm wrong, but those projections do not include a recession.
Oh yeah, if there's a recession, that spending is going to go through the roof. It's going to explode higher, and we're so listen. I don't think a recession is imminent, but it is inevitable. It's part of
Right.
life, right? It's the
Right.
business cycle. It's like death and taxes. So when we get a recession, I'm sure that we're going to spend even more money. And listen, we spent a lot of money in COVID, for example, and that stock market like that liked it a lot. And of course, we spent a lot of money after the Great Financial Crisis, and there was a shock afterwards. But for several years after, it kind of boomed when you're looking at financial assets.
Joseph, can you give us some historical context on the 5% deficit to GDP or the 7%? Well, those are just numbers for most people.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you
So
say that's high, they're like, well, I have nothing to compare it to.
yeah, that's a great point. So I would look at it first in a cultural perspective. So culturally speaking, historically speaking, we had a culture where people understood that it's not good for the government to continue to spend money. And that's actually ingrained in the DNA of our country. Because what made the US special compared to many other countries is that at its founding, the founding fathers wanted the government to be very small.
Right.
Because if the government would be very small, it would not have a lot of power. It would not be able to potentially abuse its power because the government is different from other entities, right? It has an army, and so it has a lot of power over people. We want to be careful to make sure that it doesn't grow too powerful because government is ultimately run by people, and there's always the temptation to abuse that power. So throughout our history, the government actually has been historically deficit has been very small because simply there wasn't anything to spend it on. You didn't have the right to spend it on anything. In fact, say 100 years ago, well, no, okay, 200 years ago, the government, federal government was so weak. When cars first came out, okay, so in the 1900s, the government actually did not have the power to mandate seatbelts because it just wasn't in their jurisdiction. Now it's very different today, of course. So historically speaking, the government had a very small deficit. Now, during war times, it would expand tremendously. We saw that, for example, during World War II, existential crises. So you had a lot of spending. But normally, when times are good, you never see a fiscal deficit where it is today. Let's say 6%. Now, that just doesn't happen. And in fact, 20 years ago, we even had a fiscal surplus.
Right.
What that meant was that the government actually took in more in taxes than it spent in its operations. And back then, the people, I feel like it was such a innocent time. The government was like, we have all this extra money. Let's try to save money for the taxpayers. And so what they did was they went out and they bought high yielding treasuries and retired the debt, bought it back because they didn't want to pay the high interest expense to try to save the taxpayer some interest expense. Now that time is just so far away from where we are today, where just everything is spend, spend, spend. That's how people get elected, right? They buy votes using someone else's money. How they spend money really depends on, maybe some people want to spend it by giving money to corporations. Maybe some people want to spend it by giving money to, education, free student loans and stuff like that, childcare. But it's the same thing. It's just about spending money. So it's a big anomaly, and we've never had a persistent fiscal deficit like this before. That's forecast to forever increase, never before.
Right. Okay. So let's go into some nuance because you're talking about one of the results from these deficits exploding and continue going higher and higher and higher is going to be a tailwind to consumer price inflation.
Right.
Now, most people would assume that that is because the Fed is expanding their balance sheet because interest rates are going up. There's not enough demand for treasuries. They can't handle the interest rates. So they're quote unquote monetizing the debt. And this is the Fed's balance sheet is somehow, in turn, creating more currency units in the real economy, chasing the same amount of stuff. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. But based on some of the conversations that we've had online and face to face over dinner, uh, I think you come at it more from a standpoint of the government spending itself increasing velocity or increasing the aggregate balance sheet in society, as opposed to what the Fed is doing by, let's just say, an asset swap. And that's a very, very important distinction. So, can you explain your views on that a little further?
So rather than focus on the Fed, which, as you note, I think of as an asset swap, which is impactful, but not nearly as impactful as fiscal deficit spending itself.
Right.
Now, let's go through an example. Now, let's suppose that George, you're an investor and you have $100 in your bank account. Now, I'm the government, okay? So I want to spend money. So what do? I go and I borrow it. So I issue you $100 in US treasuries and you give me $100 in deposits, right? So at the end of the day, instead of having $100 in your checking account, you have $100 in treasury securities. Now, at the end of this transaction, George, your net worth, your purchasing power is unchanged.
That's right.
However, let's say I'm the government. I took your dollars and I spent it back into the economy. In fact, since you're the only person in this hypothetical, I spent it right back to you. You're a missile. You're an arms dealer, and you sold me missiles. So I gave you $100, and you gave me missiles. Okay. So what does that mean? So at the end of the day, you have your $100 back because you sold me a missile, and you have $100 in treasury securities. Your assets are now $200. You have more purchasing power.
Exactly.
So it's the creation of the treasury itself that creates basically a money-like asset. Now, it's not exactly money. It's not like cash in your wallet where you can go and spend it at Denny's, at McDonald's. But you can easily say, you have $100 of treasuries in your Schwab account. You can easily sell it, and then you have deposits that you can withdraw. It's very much money-like. So the government is special in that it can print these money-like assets, and it does so to the tune of trillions of dollars a year. So that I think of as the real money printing that is impactful for financial assets and the real economy. What the
Yeah, and I'd
Fed
like.
does
Oh,
is
go ahead.
also important, but I think the fiscal aspect at the moment is more important.
Yeah, and I'd also add that when I gave you that $100 and you gave me that treasury, that $100 most likely didn't come out of my checking account. It most likely came out of my savings account, or else I would not have used that. If I needed that money to pay for rent, I would not have used that money to buy a treasury, right? Because I can't take that treasury down to Chipotle.
Right,
So
right.
my point there is you're taking very low velocity money, if not zero velocity money, which is pretty much what a treasury is, and you're turning it into high velocity money, even if it's going to the exact same person. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Now, think about it from a big system-wide scale. Who are the people who buy treasury securities? Honestly, I don't think it's a retail investment. I think it's an institutional investment, especially if you have a lot of money. Maybe if you
right,
have $1 billion. If you have $1 billion, well, listen, you can't really just put that at your local bank. Your bank might go bust. So you have to go and put it somewhere else. Let's say you put it in treasury securities, safe, and you get a little bit of interest. And so, the really rich people, that's low velocity money, as you note. So they take that low velocity money, buy treasuries. U.S. Treasury takes that, and what do they do with it? They spend it, right? And now it could be to okay, it could be to Social Security, it could be to payments to doctors, it could be to payment to people who are under economic hardship, but it's going to be spent to people who have higher velocity of money, right? They're not going to be super rich. The super rich maybe they get some government contracts and stuff like that. But yeah, overall, the velocity of money is of that money is going to increase.